My boyfriend said, I'm going to Coachella with the guys. No girlfriends allowed. I said, have fun. Then his best friend's girlfriend tagged me in a photo. Girls' trip to Coachella. We were at the same festival when I saw him in VIP with a woman who definitely wasn't one of the guys. My name is Sienna Vale. I was 27 when all of this happened, and for a long time I kept wondering exactly when my relationship started falling apart. At first I blamed Coachella, then I blamed Lena. Eventually I realized neither of them had started the problem. They had only exposed it. Ryan and I had been together for 2 years. We moved into a one-bedroom apartment 8 months before everything exploded. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt like ours. We split rent, shared a car payment, argued about whose turn it was to buy groceries, and spent most evenings stretched across the same couch, watching shows neither of us cared enough about to finish. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Ryan still came home every night, we still paid bills together, and we still made plans for the future. The problem was that the version of him I lived with felt a little more distant every month, and eventually those small changes became impossible to ignore. The changes were small at first. Ryan spent more time on his phone, laughed at messages he never shared, and started stepping outside whenever a call came in. When I asked why, he claimed the apartment had bad reception. The explanation made no sense, but it wasn't important enough to fight about. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Looking back, I spent months finding excuses for things that should have worried me. Work stress, money problems, burnout. Anything felt easier to believe than the possibility that our relationship was changing. Maybe every relationship eventually reached a stage where things felt less exciting. Then, 3 weeks before Coachella, Ryan walked through the front door carrying an energy I hadn't seen in months. I was folding laundry on the couch when he tossed his keys onto the counter. So, he said, trying to sound casual, the guys are finally doing Coachella. I looked up. Coachella? Yeah. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. They've been talking about it forever. Something about that answer immediately bothered me. For how long? Ryan hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Oh, off and on. Mostly group chat nonsense. I kept folding shirts. And you're going? Yeah. He smiled. It'll be fun. That was when he finally mentioned the part that mattered. It's kind of a guys only thing. I raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? No girlfriends, no partners, just a weekend with the guys. The explanation arrived a little too quickly, as if he'd already anticipated the question. I studied him for a second. How much is this trip going to cost? Ryan shrugged. Around 1,000. I almost laughed. $1,000 wasn't a casual expense for us. Not when I'd been covering extra groceries because he claimed a few freelance payments were delayed. Not when we'd recently discussed cutting back on spending. Ryan saw the expression on my face and immediately shifted gears. Come on, Sienna, it's not a big deal. I didn't say it was. You look annoyed. I'm surprised. His shoulders relaxed slightly, maybe because surprise sounded better than concerned. You're not mad? I folded another shirt. Why would I be mad? I don't know. He smiled. Some girlfriends would make a huge deal out of this. I shrugged. If you're excited about it, go have fun. His smile widened immediately. That response seemed to reassure him more than anything else I'd said. He crossed the room, kissed the top of my head, and said, That's why I love you. At the time, I smiled. Now I think he was relieved. Over the next week, little details kept changing. One day there were 4 guys going. The next day there were 6. One person was supposedly handling the Airbnb until suddenly someone else was. None of it was dramatic enough to start a fight, but it was enough to make me pay attention. The more questions I asked, the more his answers seemed to change depending on the day. One evening I asked where they were staying. He named a city. 2 days later, he named a different one. When I pointed it out, he laughed. That's because they changed the booking. Maybe they had. Maybe they hadn't. I was starting to notice how often maybe appeared in my thoughts whenever Ryan explained something. A few days later, I met Nora for dinner. Nora was dating Marcus, Ryan's best friend. We weren't especially close, but we'd spent enough time together to skip the awkward small talk. Halfway through dinner, I mentioned the trip. So Ryan's doing Coachella with the guys. Nora's fork paused. The guys? The reaction immediately caught my attention. Yeah. She stared at me, then let out a short laugh. Not because she was amused, because she'd just realized something. Marcus told me the exact same thing. I blinked. What? He said it was a boys-only trip. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Neither of us liked where the conversation was heading. What details did he give you? I asked. Nora leaned back. Not many. Honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, he was weirdly vague. My stomach tightened. Ryan, too. Nora reached for her drink. Did he show you the group chat? He flashed it at me once. She frowned. Marcus did the same thing. I looked at her. She looked at me. Then both of us reached the same conclusion at exactly the same time. Neither of us had actually seen any real proof. just enough information to stop us asking questions. Nora shook her head slowly. This is weird. I didn't answer immediately, because saying it out loud would make it real. Instead, I thought about Ryan's changing stories. I kept thinking about the expensive trip, the hidden phone, and the relief on Ryan's face when I told him to have fun. Finally, I nodded. Yeah. Nora lowered her voice. What if we went? I laughed. To Coachella? Why not? Because that's insane. No, she pointed her fork at me. What's insane is two grown men telling the exact same story while acting like they're reading from a script. I wanted to argue. Instead, I found myself asking, do you think we could still get tickets? Nora smiled. The kind of smile that told me she'd already looked. I checked yesterday. That answer should have surprised me. It didn't. Because apparently I wasn't the only woman sitting at dinner, feeling like pieces weren't fitting together. That night I came home and found Ryan packing. New clothes covered the bed. New sunglasses. New shoes. A bottle of cologne he usually saved for weddings and special occasions. I stood in the doorway. You're really preparing for this trip. It's Coachella. He barely looked up. I watched him hold up a shirt and examine it in the mirror. Who are you trying to impress? Ryan laughed. Nobody. I just don't want to look terrible in every photo. The answer came too quickly. Like he'd been expecting that question too. I smiled anyway. Then I watched him continue packing while something inside me quietly settled into place. I still didn't know exactly what was happening, but for the first time, I stopped trying to convince myself everything was normal. 2 days later, Nora and I booked tickets, rented a car, and reserved a small Airbnb about 20 minutes from the festival. I told Ryan I might spend the weekend with my older sister. He kissed me goodbye Friday morning without the slightest hint of guilt. Text me when you get there. You too. He grabbed his bag and headed toward the door. Then he stopped. And hey, don't overthink this weekend, okay? Couples need space sometimes. I watched him for a moment. There was a time that sentence would have reassured me. Instead, it made me wonder how long he'd been using space as a hiding place. Of course, I said. Have fun with the guys. Ryan smiled. Then he walked out the door. I stood there listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. And for the first time in 2 years, I realized I didn't actually believe a word he'd said. The drive to Coachella felt different from what either of us expected. If someone had looked through the photos later, they would have seen two women on a spontaneous festival weekend. There were highway selfies, coffee stops, desert landscapes, and enough sunlight to make everything look carefree. The reality inside the car was much quieter. Every conversation somehow found its way back to Ryan and Marcus. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just often enough that neither of us could pretend we weren't thinking about the same thing. The worst part was that we still didn't have proof. The hardest part was not knowing whether Ryan was actually lying or whether I was building a problem that didn't exist. For most of the drive, I kept hoping it would be the second option. Maybe Ryan really was on a guy's trip. Maybe I'd spend the weekend laughing at myself. Maybe we'd run into each other. He'd introduce me to everyone, and we'd tell this story years later as a misunderstanding that got completely out of hand. I wanted that outcome more than I wanted to catch him doing something wrong. When we arrived Friday afternoon, we checked into a small Airbnb packed with other festival goers. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep between events. While I unpacked, Nora posted a photo. 2 drinks, 2 festival wristbands, 2 women smiling at the camera. The caption simply said, "Girls trip to Coachella." She tagged me. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Ryan. I stared at the screen. Nora looked over from the other side of the room. Let me guess. I nodded. She didn't even ask who it was. I opened the message. Ryan. Wait, are you at Coachella? The question alone made my stomach tighten. Not because he seemed surprised. Because he seemed alarmed. Me. Yeah. Ryan. Seriously? Me. Last minute decision. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then appeared again. Ryan, why didn't you tell me? I read the message twice. The irony almost made me laugh. For weeks he'd been feeding me half information about this trip. Now suddenly transparency mattered. Me. Thought it would be a fun surprise. A longer pause. Ryan, that's unexpected. The word bothered me more than it should have. If my boyfriend unexpectedly showed up at the same festival, I'd be excited. Ryan sounded concerned. I looked at Nora. Marcus said the same thing, didn't he? She slowly turned her phone around. Almost identical conversation. Almost identical reaction. Neither man seemed remotely happy we were there. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. A boyfriend on a harmless trip shouldn't care. At worst, he'd be amused. At best, he'd be excited to spend part of the weekend together. Ryan sounded like someone trying to calculate a problem. I sent one more message. Me. Maybe we can grab a drink at some point. His answer arrived almost immediately. Ryan. We're pretty booked all weekend. I stared at the screen. Pretty booked. The entire weekend. At one of the largest festivals in the country. Without a single free hour. The excuse wasn't impossible. It just wasn't believable. Saturday morning, we forced ourselves to enjoy the festival. And honestly, for a while we did. The music was good. The atmosphere was fun. For a few hours, I almost forgot why I had come. Then everything changed. One of Nora's friends worked with a company sponsoring part of the event and managed to get us temporary VIP access for the afternoon. Neither of us expected anything to come from it. We certainly weren't hunting for Ryan. The VIP area was crowded with people moving between shaded lounges, food stations, and private bars. I was looking toward one of the seating sections when Nora suddenly grabbed my arm. Hard enough to stop me, Sienna. Something in her voice instantly made my pulse jump. What? She didn't answer. She pointed. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Ryan sat on one of the lounge couches. Not alone. A woman sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched whenever either of them moved. Close enough that they looked like they belonged together. The noise around me seemed to fade into the background. Not disappear. Just become irrelevant. I stared. Ryan was smiling. Actually smiling. Not the polite smile he'd been giving me for months. Not the distracted smile he'd perfected while staring at his phone. This was different. He looked more present than he had in months. Whatever they were talking about had his full attention. The woman turned slightly, and I immediately recognized her. Lena, Ryan's ex-girlfriend. The woman he had repeatedly described as ancient history. The woman he claimed he hadn't spoken to in years. The woman he once referred to as a closed chapter. Apparently, the chapter wasn't closed. It wasn't even over. I couldn't hear their conversation. I didn't need to. She showed him something on her phone. He laughed. A moment later, she touched his arm. Ryan didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned closer. I felt my stomach drop. Not because I suddenly discovered Ryan was capable of lying. Some part of me already knew that. What hurt was seeing how natural it looked. There was no awkwardness between them. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Whatever this was, it hadn't started yesterday. Beside me, Nora whispered. Oh my God. I followed her gaze. Marcus was sitting nearby. Another woman sat next to him. Not Lena. Someone else. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. The guy's trip wasn't a guy's trip. It was something else entirely. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Part of me wanted to walk straight across the lounge and demand an explanation. Part of me wanted Ryan to see me standing there and experience even a fraction of the panic he had caused. But the longer I watched him, the more I realized a confrontation wouldn't give me what I wanted. Ryan would lie. Maybe not completely, maybe not convincingly, but he would absolutely lie. I'd get excuses, context, misunderstandings. Whatever version of events gave him the best chance of surviving the conversation. I didn't want survival mode, Ryan. I wanted the truth, the real version. The version people tell when they think nobody's watching. I pulled out my phone. Nora glanced at me. What are you doing? I zoomed in on the lounge area, then took one photo, then another, then several more. Every angle, every interaction, every moment. If Ryan wanted to tell stories later, I wanted facts. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We stayed at the festival, but neither of us was really present anymore. Every conversation eventually circled back to what we'd seen. Every explanation sounded worse than the last. By Sunday afternoon, I assumed Ryan would avoid me completely. Instead, fate handled that for us. Nora and I were standing near a food vendor when I heard someone call my name. Sienna? I turned around. Ryan stood there. For a split second, genuine panic crossed his face. It vanished almost immediately. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. I did. Then the smile appeared. The careful one. The controlled one. Wow, he said. I didn't know you'd be over here. The lie landed between us so casually, it was almost impressive. I smiled back. Neither did I. Ryan studied my face. I could practically see him trying to figure out how much I knew. How much I'd seen. How dangerous this conversation might become. You having fun? He asked. Yeah, I nodded. It's been a great weekend. Something flickered in his expression. Just for a second. Then it disappeared. Good, he said. I'm glad. Behind him stood Marcus and a few other familiar faces. No Lena. No mystery women. Just the version of reality they wanted visible. Ryan stepped forward and hugged me. Anyone watching would have seen a happy couple unexpectedly running into each other at a music festival. What they wouldn't have seen was me standing there wondering how many lies were currently wrapped around me. When he finally stepped back, he looked relieved. That bothered me more than anything else. A boyfriend who had nothing to hide wouldn't be relieved. He'd be excited. Ryan looked like a man who thought he'd narrowly escaped something. A few minutes later, we went our separate ways. I watched him disappear into the crowd. And somewhere deep down, a decision had already started forming. I wasn't going to confront him at Coachella. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to let Ryan come home. Then I was going to find out exactly how long he'd been lying. The drive home felt longer than the drive there. Nobody said much. The excitement that had filled the car on Friday was gone, replaced by the kind of quiet that follows a bad answer to a question you didn't want to ask. Every now and then, Nora and I compared notes. Small details, things we'd noticed but hadn't mentioned in the moment. The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. Ryan hadn't looked surprised to see Lena. Marcus hadn't looked surprised to see the other woman. Neither interaction felt new. Whatever was happening had been happening for a while. By the time I got back to the apartment Monday evening, I already knew one thing. I wasn't ready to confront Ryan. Not yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed certainty. Ryan came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. The gesture would have meant something a few months earlier. Now it felt strategic, almost like he was trying to maintain normalcy before I had a chance to question it. He kissed my cheek, dropped into a chair, and started talking about the trip. He talked about the music, the crowds, the weather, and especially the guys. Every story seemed carefully selected, like he'd already decided which details I was allowed to hear. Every photo he showed me had been carefully selected. No Lena. No VIP lounge. No unexplained women. Nothing that contradicted the version of events he wanted me to believe. I sat across from him and listened. The strange part wasn't that he lied. It was how comfortable he seemed doing it, as if he had already convinced himself this version of the story was real. That night, after Ryan fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room with my laptop. I reviewed our lease, checked account information, organized financial documents, made copies of anything important. I wasn't planning a breakup. Not yet, but I wanted options. If things got worse, I didn't want to be scrambling. Over the next few days, I quietly prepared. Important documents went into a secure locker at work. I opened a savings account Ryan didn't know about. I reviewed every major expense we shared. Nothing dramatic, just practical steps, the kind you hope you'll never need. By Thursday, I had reached a decision. I needed to know what Ryan was doing when he thought I wasn't watching. So, before leaving for what Ryan believed would be a weekend with my sister, I set up a small camera in the living room. Nothing invasive, nothing hidden in private spaces, just the common area. If I was wrong, I'd delete the footage and move on. If I wasn't, I'd finally have answers. Friday evening, I sat on Nora's couch with my laptop open. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Ryan came home, made dinner, watched television, scrolled through his phone. Normal. Then, a little after 8 o'clock, the front door opened. A woman walked into the apartment behind him. At first, I thought it was Lena. It wasn't. The woman looked familiar, though. After a few seconds, I remembered why. Her name was Claire. Ryan had mentioned her before. She worked in marketing and occasionally collaborated with him on freelance projects. What immediately stood out wasn't that she was there. It was how comfortable they seemed. There was none of the awkwardness you'd expect from coworkers stopping by after work. Claire kicked off her shoes without being asked. Ryan handed her a glass of wine without asking what she wanted. She knew where everything was. That told me this wasn't the first visit. Nora leaned toward the screen. Has she been there before? I don't know. But the answer felt obvious. Ryan moved around the apartment like someone completely at ease. That part mattered. Months of getting away with lies had made him careless. I wasn't acting like a man worried about getting caught. I was acting like a man who believed nobody was looking. The conversation started casually. Work, travel, people they both knew. Then Claire smiled and asked, "So, how'd Coachella go with Lena?" The room around me seemed to disappear. Nora slowly turned toward me. Neither of us spoke. We just listened. Ryan laughed. Not nervously, not defensively, comfortably. Claire wasn't learning new information. She already knew about Lena, which suddenly explained why Ryan seemed so relaxed. The way Claire spoke made it obvious she'd heard versions of this story before. Claire wasn't some random coworker. At some point, she'd become someone he trusted with parts of his personal life. Someone who knew things he was hiding from me. It was complicated, Ryan said. Claire rolled her eyes. You make everything complicated. Ryan grinned. Maybe. So what's happening now? He leaned back on the couch. I don't know yet. The answer sounded rehearsed, like he'd been saying it for weeks. Claire took a sip of wine. You've been saying that for months. Months. The word landed harder than I expected. Not weeks. Months. Ryan shook his head. I need to figure things out. Figure out what? Claire wasn't being judgmental. If anything, she sounded tired, like she'd heard the conversation before. Ryan stared toward the kitchen for a second, then shrugged. Lena and I still have history. And Sienna? Ryan hesitated. Just long enough. Sienna and I have a life together. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because he mentioned me. The distinction hit harder than I expected. Lena was his history. I was the life he'd already built. Hearing him separate us so neatly made me feel like a problem he hadn't decided how to solve. You can't keep both forever. I know. Then what are you waiting for? Ryan rubbed his forehead. I don't know. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. No dramatic confession. No cartoon villain speech. Just a man trying to justify choices that became harder to justify the longer he talked. Every explanation shifted slightly. Sometimes he claimed confusion. Sometimes timing. Sometimes fear. Once he even suggested he didn't want to hurt anybody. That might have sounded convincing if he hadn't already spent months lying to both sides. Then Claire asked a question that changed everything. What happens if Lena asks you to commit? Ryan didn't answer immediately. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Finally, he said, I'll deal with it when I have to. Claire frowned. That's not an answer. Ryan stared at his glass. I know. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not anger, not heartbreak, certainty. Listening to him talk, I realized we weren't fighting for the same relationship anymore. Ryan wasn't fighting for us. I was delaying a decision while keeping every option available. When the recording finally ended, I closed my laptop. Nora didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked the only question that mattered. What are you going to do? I looked down at the dark screen, at the reflection staring back at me, at the woman who had spent months explaining away things she should have trusted herself to question. Then I took a slow breath. I'm ending it. Nora nodded. When? I thought about Ryan sitting in our apartment, about Coachella, about Lena, about Claire, about all the conversations I never should have needed to hear. Then I stood up and grabbed my keys. Tomorrow. Ryan was sitting on the couch when I walked into the apartment the next afternoon. A basketball game played quietly on the television. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the table beside him. For a second, the scene looked so normal that it almost made me question everything I'd seen. Almost. Then Ryan smiled. Hey, I thought you'd be gone until tomorrow. I came back early. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second before recovering. Everything okay with your sister? Yeah. I set my bag down near the door and sat across from him. Ryan muted the television. The smile disappeared completely. Something about the room had changed. He could feel it. Maybe he didn't know what I knew, but he knew I knew something. You all right? He asked. I'm fine. The answer wasn't convincing. We both knew it. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan leaned forward. What's going on? I looked at him carefully, at the man I'd lived with, planned with, defended, trusted, and suddenly I was exhausted. Not angry, not emotional, just tired. Tired of wondering. Tired of doubting myself. Tired of carrying questions he already knew the answers to. We need to talk. His shoulders stiffened. Okay. I nodded. Tell me about Coachella. Ryan blinked. What about it? Anything. The question sounded simple. The reaction wasn't. His eyes moved away from mine. Not dramatically. Just briefly. Long enough. It was fun. Who was there? The guys. I held his gaze. Just the guys? Ryan laughed. A forced laugh. What is this? A question. Sienna. No, just answer it. He shifted in his seat. The confidence he'd worn all week was starting to crack. You already know who went. Then say it. His jaw tightened. I could see him trying to figure out where the conversation was heading. What evidence I had. What I'd seen. What version of events was still salvageable. Finally, he shrugged. Marcus, Dylan, a few other people. I nodded. And Lena? The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost shocking. There it was. The reaction I'd been waiting for. Not confusion. Recognition. Ryan knew exactly why I was asking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back. Slowly. Carefully. Like a man stepping onto unstable ground. Who told you that? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he skipped right past denial. Straight to information gathering. Nobody innocent starts there. I asked a question. Ryan rubbed his forehead. Lena was there. The admission came out reluctantly. As in she happened to be there? He hesitated. We ran into each other. I nodded. Convenient. His eyes narrowed. Why are you doing this? The question annoyed me. Not because he asked it. Because he was already trying to reposition himself as the victim. I'm doing what? Interrogating me. The word hung between us. Interrogating. As if asking about a woman he'd lied about was somehow unreasonable. Ryan leaned forward. You've been acting weird ever since that trip. I stared at him. For a second, I almost admired the attempt. The conversation had started with his lies. Somehow we were already discussing my behavior. Classic Ryan. When accountability approached, he always found a detour. You told me you hadn't spoken to Lena in years. His expression tightened. That wasn't exactly true. Interesting choice of words. Ryan sighed heavily. I knew this would happen. I folded my arms. Knew what would happen? You'd take everything the wrong way. A few months earlier, that explanation probably would have made me question myself. This time it only made me tired. Not a confession. Not an apology. A suggestion that the problem wasn't what he'd done. The problem was how I'd interpreted it. For months, that tactic probably would have worked. Now it sounded pathetic. Ryan continued. Lena reached out a few months ago. A few months? Yeah. Why didn't you tell me? His answer arrived immediately. Because I knew you'd react like this. I stared at him. That was the thing about dishonest people. Sometimes they accidentally reveal more than they intend. Ryan genuinely believed secrecy was justified if honesty might create consequences. I let that sit for a moment. Then I reached into my bag. Ryan watched carefully. The moment I pulled out my phone, something changed in his face. Not panic yet, just caution. I opened the photo album, then placed the phone on the coffee table between us. Ryan looked down. His face went completely still. Photo after photo. VIP lounge. Ryan and Lena. Ryan leaning toward Lena. Ryan smiling at Lena. Ryan touching Lena's arm. Each image stripped away another excuse. The room felt smaller with every swipe. Finally, Ryan looked away. That isn't what it looks like. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course. That sentence. Every liar seemed to keep it stored somewhere for emergencies. What does it look like? Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he grabbed onto the first explanation he could find. We were talking. Clearly. It wasn't some affair. You spent months hiding her. I wasn't hiding her. I stared at him. I immediately corrected himself. Too late. The damage was already done. Ryan rubbed both hands over his face. This isn't fair. That one surprised me. Fair? You're acting like everything was planned. His voice rose slightly. You don't know what things have been like. I sat back and listened. Because now we had reached the blame-shifting phase. The part where the lie becomes someone else's responsibility. Ryan stood and started pacing. You've been distant too. I almost laughed. Seriously? We haven't been good for months. So your solution was another woman? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. For the first time all afternoon, he genuinely seemed trapped. Not because he felt guilty, because every explanation led back to the same place. Him. The room went quiet. Ryan looked exhausted. I was exhausted too. Then I made a decision. The photos weren't enough. I wanted him to hear himself. I opened another file on my phone. Ryan frowned. What is that? I pressed play, and the sound of his own voice filled the apartment. The color disappeared from his face almost immediately. This wasn't Coachella anymore. This wasn't suspicion. This wasn't interpretation. This was Ryan sitting in our apartment, talking openly about Lena, Claire, and keeping his options open while I paid half the rent and planned a future with him. For the first time since the conversation started, he stopped talking. And I knew the real confrontation had finally begun. The recording played for less than 10 minutes. It felt much longer. Ryan didn't interrupt it. He didn't try to explain it away. He just stood there listening to his own voice fill the room. At first he looked shocked, then embarrassed, then angry. Not angry at himself, angry that the conversation existed at all. The moment the recording ended, neither of us spoke. Ryan stared at the floor. I watched him carefully. For the first time since Coachella, there was nowhere left for him to go. Between the photos and the recording, there wasn't much left for Ryan to deny. Still, Ryan tried. Of course he did. That conversation wasn't what it sounded like. I laughed softly and shook my head. You really heard all of that and decided that was your best move? His jaw tightened. You recorded me. There it was. The pivot. The attempt to make the discussion about my actions instead of his. I wasn't surprised. Ryan had been redirecting accountability for years. This was just the most desperate version of it. You brought another woman into our apartment. Claire wasn't... I don't care what Claire was. My voice stayed calm. That seemed to frustrate him more than yelling would have. What exactly are you upset about? He asked. The question hung in the air. For a second, I genuinely wondered if he heard himself. What am I upset about? Ryan threw his hands up. You act like I cheated on you. I stared at him. Then I pointed toward the phone. You spent months hiding Lena. We were talking. You lied. It wasn't that simple. Actually, it was. Ryan began pacing again. The more trapped he felt, the more restless he became. I was confused. There it is. What? The excuse. His head snapped toward me. I'm not making excuses. You absolutely are. Ryan laughed bitterly. No, Sienna, I'm trying to explain. I folded my arms. No, you're trying to find an explanation that makes you feel less guilty. That landed. I could tell. Because for the first time all afternoon, Ryan didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat down and looked away. The apartment became quiet. Outside, someone walked past the hallway. A car horn sounded somewhere down the street. Life kept moving. Meanwhile, 2 years of history sat between us on that coffee table. Finally, Ryan spoke, more quietly this time. I never planned for any of this. I nodded. I believe that. His eyes lifted toward me. The answer clearly wasn't what he expected. I do, I continued. I don't think you planned it. I think you kept making selfish decisions and convinced yourself you'd figure it out later. Ryan stared at me, then looked away again. Because deep down, he knew that was exactly what happened. A few minutes passed. Eventually, he rubbed his face and sighed. I talked to Lena again 3 months ago. There it was. The first honest sentence he'd spoken all day. I said nothing, Ryan continued. At first it wasn't serious. I almost stopped him. Not because I disagreed, because I was tired of hearing how every bad decision began as something harmless. But I let him talk. We started texting. He swallowed. Then talking more. Then Coachella. Ryan nodded. Yeah. The room fell quiet again. I waited. If there was more, he would say it. And there was. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out. I laughed once. Not cruelly. Just tired. Figure what out? His answer came slowly. Who I wanted. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I didn't already know. Because hearing it out loud removed every remaining illusion. For months, I'd been sharing a home with someone who viewed our relationship as one option among several. Ryan looked genuinely ashamed now. Unfortunately, shame arrives too late to be useful. After a while, he asked the question I'd been expecting. So what happens now? I looked around the apartment, the couch, the kitchen, the photos on the shelf, the life we'd built. Then I looked back at him. You move out. His eyes closed briefly, as if he'd known that answer from the beginning. Neither of us argued after that. There wasn't much left to fight about. The relationship was over. The only thing remaining was logistics. Unfortunately, logistics turned out to be harder than the breakup. Ryan didn't move out immediately. At first, he claimed he needed time, then money, then somewhere to stay. Part of me understood. The other part remembered how much consideration he'd shown our relationship before risking it. So I gave him 3 weeks. No more. No less. During those 3 weeks, we lived together like strangers. We coordinated schedules, discussed bills, handled paperwork. Beyond that, there wasn't much conversation. The strangest thing was how quickly normal habits disappeared. No shared dinners. No goodnight kisses. No inside jokes. Once trust left, everything else seemed to leave with it. 3 weeks later, Ryan finally moved out. I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt tired, like I'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had only just set it down. The next few days were quieter than I expected. Then things got messy again. A week after Ryan left, I noticed several items missing. A speaker, kitchen equipment, a tablet. Nothing enormous, just enough to make me suspicious. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. I texted Ryan. His response changed 3 times in a single conversation. First, he claimed the items were his. Then he claimed we bought them together. Then he claimed I'd given them to him. Every answer contradicted the previous one. By the end of the exchange, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was exhausted. Ryan disputed ownership of several items, which forced me to gather receipts, bank statements, and old order confirmations before the hearing. Then I filed the paperwork. The small claims hearing happened about a month later. Ryan looked irritated the entire time. Not worried, not apologetic, just irritated, as if the inconvenience itself was unfair. The judge reviewed the evidence, asked a handful of questions, then ruled in my favor. The entire thing lasted less than 20 minutes. Outside the courthouse, Ryan stopped me before I reached my car. Sienna. I turned. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something meaningful, something that would explain everything, something that would somehow make the ending feel different. Instead, he asked, was any of it real? I stared at him. What? The relationship. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, because it wasn't. I looked at the man who had spent months keeping one foot in our relationship and one foot somewhere else. Then I answered honestly. For me, yes. Ryan looked down, and for the first time since this started, he had absolutely nothing to say. A few days after the court hearing, Ryan returned the remaining items. He left them outside my apartment door. No note, no apology, no attempt to talk. Just a cardboard box with my speaker, my tablet, and a few other things stacked inside. I carried everything into the apartment and closed the door behind me. That should have felt like the final chapter. It didn't. Not yet. Because life rarely gives you a clean ending the moment you want one. Over the next few weeks, mutual friends continued bringing Ryan into conversations. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. A few people wanted updates. Others wanted details. Some were simply curious. Apparently, a surprising number of people had known parts of the story long before I did. That realization stung, not because anyone had directly lied to me, because several people had watched things unfold and chosen silence. One evening, Nora called while I was making dinner. Guess who reached out to Marcus? I didn't even have to ask. Lena? Yep. I leaned against the kitchen counter. And? Nora laughed. And apparently Ryan's version of events wasn't exactly the same version everyone else got. That wasn't shocking. Ryan had spent months managing information. The only surprising part would have been consistency. What happened? From what Marcus heard, Lena finally figured out how much Ryan had been hiding. I stirred the pasta sauce slowly. What do you mean? She knew you existed. I wasn't surprised. She didn't know how serious things were. That part didn't surprise me either. Ryan had always preferred gray areas. Gray areas gave him room to maneuver. Nora continued. She thought you two were basically done. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The same story Ryan had probably been telling everyone. Not technically broken up. Not technically together. Just enough ambiguity to keep all his options available. What happened when she found out? She left. Simple. Direct. No dramatic twist. No revenge. No competition. She left. Honestly, that made me respect her more than I expected. A week later, Ryan called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Curiosity won. Hello? For a moment, he didn't speak. Then I heard him exhale. Hey. His voice sounded different. Not devastated. Just tired. What do you need? A long pause followed. Then he asked, Can we talk? I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because the timing was unbelievable. Months earlier, I'd been trying to have conversations. Now he suddenly wanted one. I don't think that's a good idea. Sienna, please. The request sounded sincere. Unfortunately, sincerity arrives a little late when trust is already gone. I don't know what we're supposed to talk about. Anything. I looked around the apartment. The walls had been repainted. The furniture had been rearranged. The space already felt different, already felt lighter. What exactly are you hoping happens here? Ryan didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I don't know. The honesty would have impressed me once. Now it just made me sad. Because that sentence described almost every major decision he'd made during the previous 6 months. I don't know. I don't know who I want. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what happens next. After a while, hearing I don't know stopped sounding honest and started sounding familiar. Ryan. Yeah? I genuinely hope things work out for you. The silence on the other end felt different this time. Not awkward. Resigned. But I looked through the living room window toward the city lights outside. But I'm not part of that anymore. Neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, Okay. A few seconds later, the call ended. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal. Not immediately. Not all at once. Just little pieces at a time. I spent more time with friends. Started traveling again. Stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed. Stopped replaying old conversations in my head. Stopped wondering whether I could have prevented any of it. The apartment changed too. The plants got bigger. The empty shelves filled up. The room stopped feeling haunted by old memories. One Friday evening, almost a year after Coachella, I came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. I kicked off my shoes, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat on the balcony with dinner balanced on my lap. The city was quiet, not silent, just peaceful. Traffic moved below. Someone laughed in a nearby apartment. Music drifted faintly through an open window somewhere down the block. For a while, I simply sat there eating and watching the lights. Sitting there, I realized something that would have been impossible a year earlier. I hadn't thought about Ryan all day. Not once. No anger. No curiosity. No urge to check anything. I smiled. For a long time, I'd assumed healing would feel bigger than that. Then I looked down and noticed my dinner had gone cold. I'd been sitting there for almost 20 minutes, watching the city lights without checking my phone once. A year earlier, that would have been impossible. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from Nora. Dinner next week? I smiled and typed back. Absolutely. A few seconds later, she replied. Good. And this time we're choosing the vacation, not our boyfriends. I laughed out loud, then set the phone down. The night air felt cool. The food was still warm. I finished my dinner and stayed on the balcony a little longer, watching the lights across the city. My phone stayed silent beside me. For once, I didn't feel the need to check it.